Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. The Excellency to Kiai Haji Muhammad Hasan Mutawakil Allah SIMM as the chairman of Zainul Sanggong Islamic Boarding School. The Excellency to the rector of Unjah Genggong Islamic University, Associate Professor Dr. Abdul Aziz Wahab BAM EG. The Excellency to Supervisor 1 Dr. Zainuddin MPD, the Excellency to Supervisor 2, Mr. Ferry MPD, and unforgettable my beloved mother. Okay, in this video, my name is Iqbal Dwi Maulana from English Education Department last semester. In this video, I will explain about my proposal thesis with title a qualitative study on the imbalance between theory and practice in student speaking ability. Okay, the first point is about the reason for choosing a title. First, there is a gap between students' theoretical knowledge and their speaking ability. Although students have learned English for many years, their communicative competence is still low. Second, based on observation at Istiqlal English course, English instruction difficulty tends to emphasize grammar explanation and written exercise more than speaking practice. This condition creates an imbalance between theory and practice. Third, most previous studies focus on teaching methods or speaking difficulties in general, but they do not specifically explore the imbalance between theory and practice in a pesantren-based English course using a qualitative approach. Okay, the next is chapter 1 about the background of the study. In this slide, there are 4 points. The first is students learn English for many years, strong in grammar and vocabulary. Next is weak in speaking ability. The last is learning focus more on theory. They study grammar, memorize vocabulary, and complete various written exercises as part of their formal education. They often achieve good scores in written tests and understand language structures theoretically. However, many of them still cannot speak English fluently or confidently in real communication situations. When they are asked to express their ideas orally, they hesitate, pause frequently, and sometimes switch to their first language. This happens because English learning often focuses more on theoretical knowledge than on meaningful speaking practice. Classroom activities are frequently centered on grammar explanation, translation, and written assignment rather than interactive communication. As a result, there is a gap between what students know and what they can actually say. They possess passive knowledge of English, but they struggle to transform that knowledge into active speaking ability. Next is about research gap and novelty. In this slide, there are 4 points. The first is focusing on imbalance between theory and practice. The second is conducted in a pesantren-based English course. Next is using qualitative descriptive approach. The last is exploring students' real experiences deeply. Okay, the research gap and novelty from previous study of my research proposal is first, this research does not only discuss speaking difficulties, but it focuses specifically on the imbalance between theory and practice as the root cause of the problem. Second, the research is conducted a pesantren-based English course which has received limited attention in previous studies. Third, this study uses a qualitative descriptive approach to explore students' experiences deeply, not just measure their speaking scores. Therefore, this research provides a new perspective by highlighting instructional imbalance as a key factor affecting student speaking. The strongest novelty of this research is that it highlights the imbalance between theory and practice as the underlying cause of speaking problems, especially in a pesantren-based non-formal English learning context using a qualitative approach. Limit research on imbalance between theory and practice in pesantren based on English course using a qualitative study. Okay, the next is research problem. In this slide, there are 4. The first is hesitate to speak, lack confidence, fear making mistake, and main issue, imbalance between theory and practice. Okay, the research problem is based on observation at Istiqlal English course. Students understand grammar rules and sentence structures quite well. They are able to answer written questions correctly and explain certain language patterns when asked. However, when they are required to speak English spontaneously, many of them hesitate and struggle to express their ideas clearly. They often pause for a long time, speak in very short sentences, or avoid speaking altogether. They lack confidence and are afraid of making mistakes, especially in pronunciation and grammar. Some students also feel anxious when speaking in front of their peers, which further reduces their willingness to participate in oral activities. Okay, the next slide is about research question. There are 2 points. First is what factors cause the imbalance between theory and practice. Second is what difficulties do students face in speaking despite learning the theory. Okay, for research question is the study tries to answer the 2 main questions related to imbalance between theory and practice in speaking instruction. The first question is what factors cause the imbalance in the learning process. This question aims to explore possible causes such as teaching methods, limited speaking activities, classroom focus, and institutional policies. It seeks to understand why theoretical instruction becomes more dominant than communicative practice. By identifying these factors, the study intends to reveal the root of the problem in speaking instruction. The second question is what difficulties do students face when they try to speak English, even though they have learned the theory? This question focuses on students' real experiences when using English orally in the classroom. It explores psychological difficulties such as lack of confidence, fear of making mistakes, and speaking anxiety. It also considers linguistic problems such as limited vocabulary and pronunciation issues. Through this question, the study aims to understand how the imbalance directly affects students' speaking ability. Okay, the next is research objective. There are 3 points. The first is identify factors of imbalance. Second, explores the student's speaking difficulties. Third, understand its impact on speaking ability. The objectives of the study are identify the factors that cause the imbalance between theory and practice in speaking instruction, to explore the difficulties faced by imbalance affect their overall speaking ability. The study aims to provide a deeper explanation of why students struggle to speak despite having learned the theoretical aspect of the language. By examining both of the causes and the impact of this imbalance, the research seeks to offer meaningful insight into improving speaking instruction. Of the study, the first is for teachers, for institution, for students, and the last is for future researchers. This research has both theoretical and practical significance. The first is for teachers. It helps them reflect on their teaching strategies. For institution, it gives suggestions to improve speaking programs. For students, it increases awareness about the importance of practice. And the last is, and for future researchers, it becomes a reference for similar studies. Okay, the next is chapter 2, that is about review of related literature. There are 2 points. The first is communicative language teaching, or CLT. The next is input hypothesis from question. Communicative language teaching, or CLT, introduced by Dale Hymes, emphasizes communicative competence as the main goal of language learning. According to Hymes, knowing a language is not only about understanding grammar rules, but also about knowing how to use the language appropriately in real social context. CLT encourages interactive classroom activities such as discussion, role plays, and real communication tasks. In addition, the input hypothesis proposed by Stephen Krashen explained that language acquisition occurs when learners receive comprehensible input, which is slightly above their current level of competence known as. This input can come from teachers' explanation. However, while input and theoretical knowledge are essential, they are not sufficient to develop speaking ability. Students may understand grammar and vocabulary, but without sufficient opportunities to practice speaking, they may struggle to use the language in real communication. Okay, the next is about conceptual framework. In this slide, I put a picture from my conceptual framework. This conceptual framework explains the relationship between theory and practice in speaking interaction. At the top, the main issue of this study is the imbalance between theory and practice. This means that learning focuses more on grammar and writing exercise rather than speaking activities. This imbalance is influenced by several factors, such as too much theoretical explanation, minimal speaking practice, and teaching methods that are not communicative. These factors make students more familiar with written text than oral communication. Because of this condition, students experience several difficulties, including lack of confidence, fear of making mistakes, and speaking anxiety. Even though they understand theory, they feel nervous when speaking English. Finally, these difficulties lead to the impact, which is low speaking ability and poor fluency. In other words, students know English in theory, but they cannot use it effectively in real communication. Okay, the last is chapter 3 about research method. In this slide, there are 3 points that first is qualitative descriptive design, research site, Istiqlal English course, participants, 1 student from each class, and 2 tutor from English course. This study involves 1 student from each English course class and 2 tutor as research participant. The selection of one student from each class is intended selection of 1 student from each class. It intended to obtain a representative overview of the factors contributing to the imbalance between theoretical knowledge and practical application in the learning process. Meanwhile, the inclusion of 2 tutors aims to examine the institutional and pedagogical factors that may influence the occurrence of the imbalance. From the tutor's perspective, this study is expected to reveal and institutional policies that contribute to the dynamics between theoretical interaction and practical application. Okay, the next is that data collection. The first is observation, interview, and documentation. I collect data through 3 techniques used. First, observation to see classroom activities. Second, interview to explore students' experiences and perception. And the third is documentation such as syllabus and teaching materials to support the data. Okay, the next is about the presence of the researcher. In this qualitative research, the researcher plays a central role as the main instrument in collecting and analyzing the data. I am directly involved in observing classroom activities, conducting interviews with students and the tutor, and collecting relevant documents at Istiqlal English course. During classroom observation, I act as a non-participant observer. This means I do not interfere with the teaching and learning process. I only observe and record the data related to the imbalance between theory and practice in speaking interaction. My presence in the research setting helped me understand the learning context more deeply, especially students' experiences and classroom interaction. To minimize bias, I apply triangulation by comparing data from observation, interviews, and documentation. I also maintain ethical consideration by informing participants about the research purpose and ensuring confidently. Okay, the next slide is about data analysis. First is data reduction, data display, and the last is conclusion and verification triangulation for credibility. The data will be analyzed in three steps. For first, data reduction to select important information. Second, data display to organize the data. Third, conclusion drawing and verification. I use triangulation to ensure the credibility of the findings. Okay, the next slide is about trustworthiness. There are four. For the first is credibility. Second, transferability. The third is dependability, and the last is confirmability. First, credibility. To ensure credibility, I use triangulation by collecting data from observation, interviews, and documentation. I compare the data from different sources to check consistency. I also conduct prolonged engagement in the research setting to better understand the learning context. Second, transferability. I provide detailed description about the research setting, participant, and learning process at Istiqlal English course. This allows readers to determine whether the findings can be applied to similar contexts. Third is dependability. I clearly describe all research procedures, including data collection and data analysis steps. This ensures that the research process is consistent and can be evaluated by others. The last is for confirmability. To ensure that the findings are based on actual data, not personal opinions, I support conclusion with evidence from interviews, observation notes, and documentation. Through these strategies, the trustworthiness of this research can be maintained. Okay, that's all my explanation. I'm so sorry for making mistake. And last I say, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh.